Uh, Gina Bixby actually had worked for the Daily Progress in Charlottesville, Virginia, before she came to Loco 360 and covered city government and happenings in the city and did a lot of reporting about the Confederate statue removal back in July 2021. Um, and what's interesting is that in MoCo 360 and Bethesda and for Montgomery County, she's been knee deep in the current election that we had, primary election. And so I hope she'll talk about that as well. Um, uh, Ginny, welcome to our meeting. Uh,
Hi.
and in the short time, let me spotlight you and make you a co-host if you want to show any content. You don't have to show any content. And make a co-host
Okay, great. Thank you.
and spotlight for everyone.
Okay. I think I'm mostly just gonna talk, but thanks for having me. I'm excited to meet you all. My name's Ginny Bixby. I am the senior reporter at MoCo 360, which is a local news outlet that covers local news in Montgomery County, Maryland. I cover mostly local politics and government. Of course, there are other things that come under my purview in local news. I like to say, especially with government reporting, kind of everything that happens can get connected back to the government. So I sometimes pick up education reporting, public safety. So I do a little of it all, but I would say a lot of my focus surrounds both elections, the Montgomery County local government, as well as the Maryland General Assembly when it's in session. So that's what I do. Also, forgive me, I'm a little sniffly, I'm a little under the weather, so I apologize for that. This week, I think as Jonathan said, I know a lot of you are not necessarily from Maryland, but I think probably a lot of you were following the big election. And yes, please send questions. I'd be happy to answer them, especially to hear kind of since I know that some of you are probably from Montgomery County and some of you aren't, just what you're interested in hearing about. Um, and we just had the election. I'm sure a lot of you were very closely following that Senate race. It got pretty big. I know that I have family that still lives in Virginia. I'm from Virginia, and they were talking about getting the ads still because of the local television. So that we just had that election, which I will say I covering for the last that's been almost exactly a year because Ben Cardin said he was retiring about a year ago, and then that just kind of spiraled everything as David Trone said he was going to run for Senate. That opened up a congressional seat, which was also a race that I covered because that congressional seat covers part of Montgomery County as well as other parts of Maryland, including Frederick, Allegheny, Garrett, some of the smaller counties. So that kind of set this spiral going. And now, since David Trone lost the primary, he's kind of given up his seat, which is a very interesting dynamic. Also, probably I know nationally there's been a lot of coverage of Trone put I think so he put almost 60 million like of his own money into this race. But also beyond that, his campaign was like the most there was something in the Wall Street Journal I saw like where he was compared to all the other Senate campaigns. So here in Maryland we've got some very interesting races. I think there's still a lot that will that has we've you know we've yet to know. Larry Hogan is the Republican nominee, and he's shown in the past that he can win even in a blue state when he won his election for governor. So I think that there's a lot ahead of us. And then on the congressional side, the woman who won, she entered the race relatively later since the race kind of started in May of 2023. She entered in October. So whereas most of the candidates had entered in May or later that summer. So she had a little.
Sorry, Ginny, you're talking about Trone's seat, the 8th district,
Yes.
the
I'm
6th
talking about
district.
Yes, the sixth congressional district. But her name is April McLean Delaney. She is the wife of John Delaney, who held the seat several years ago, and also many of you probably know as a previous presidential candidate in the Democratic Party. she has received the Democratic nomination, and she kind of was somebody who came a bit out of nowhere. She's a lot of her work has been in not communications as in the person doing the communications, but like communications policy and things like that. So she also put not quite as much as Trone, but she put about $1 million of her own money into the race. So I think that there's some very interesting dynamics there. But she has won the Democratic nomination. On the Republican side, Neil Parrott, who's a former General Assembly member for several sessions, has this will be his third time running for this seat. So it's definitely an interesting election. And yes, I cover the local county government, which never, never a dull moment. Jonathan, I'm sure, can tell you as well. There's never a dull moment in Montgomery County. Um, but yes, that's kind of what I do, and I'm happy to take questions about anything that anybody's interested about, working in local news in general. If you're from the area, if there's anything that you are particularly interested in, I'd love to hear.
Well, isn't there a Virginia election coming up next week? This week? Th-
I believe so. I'm a little less familiar with that one, but I know I definitely recommend my friend Margaret Bartell. She works for WAMU. She's been doing some good coverage, but I think that that's beginning. The early voting is starting in the congressional race, and then we'll go through to middle of June, I believe. But I'm definitely less familiar with that race. But also
if you could send us at some point put in the chat a link to her that we can send out in the recap of the meeting, that would be very helpful. So thanks.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm always happy to collect to help or sorry, help connect with other local news for sure. And WAMU is great. I've appeared on their program a few times. But if people don't have questions, I'm also just happy to share. I know Jonathan, you talked about sharing some reporting stories. So I'd be happy to share some of those. Recently something that I've been covering that has been oh, someone has their hand raised.
Yeah, I'm just curious about that Trone also Brooks race.
Mhm.
And um, Trone has run for a couple of different offices besides the congressional one that he's held for a while. Do you have an opinion about why he lost that race to also Brooks? Um, just from what
Yeah.
your experiences recently.
Yeah, I will be honest, I was very surprised that it was not closer that night, especially because I've written about this and some of you might know like the election hasn't been certified because there's still mail-in ballots and they can receive in Maryland you if your mail-in ballot is postmarked by primary day, it can be received up to 10 days later. So they legally cannot certify it until 10 days later. So there are times when like races have been very, very close where nobody will concede and there's like counts and so when the polls, like the Emerson College poll that came out about a week before the election said that they were only going to be a point apart in difference, I was anticipating that we would not know on Tuesday night or neither was going to concede or something like that. So I was definitely surprised by how strong of a margin there was. And I've been trying to sort it out for myself. I think it's possible that Trode has just turned people off by the amount of money he's funneling into the campaign. In the forums I covered with him, he really tries to position himself as an outsider and he says, I don't take money from PACs, et cetera, et cetera. But you could argue that the reason other candidates take money from PACs is because they don't have their own multi-billion-dollar empire to put their money into. So I think that probably a lot of voters just got sick of that. But I'll be honest, I did not, I had friends and family asking me, who do you think will win this race? And I was like, I have no idea. I thought it was going to be much much closer. So
Yeah.
yes, my guess is people were just turned off by the money, and I think that that's something that's happening in politics right now, especially because politically they aren't that differently aligned. They have pretty similar policy.
It's to me, it seems strange that a guy who can use his own money and not take any from anybody else would that would have a negative effect. But you could be right, you know. It's
Yeah.
just something that puzzles me.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just want to say that I appreciate very much that you chose journalism as a career and politics in particular, apparently. Is that always been an interest of yours? I mean, the political stuff?
Um, yeah, I mean, when I first knew I wanted to go to journalism, I was really more interested in the longer form, like magazine feature, like think the New Yorker, the Atlantic, that kind of writing. Um, and then when I needed a job, I got a job at the newspaper in Charlottesville. And I really fell in love with covering local government. And I think that and politics, and I think that I have had people in my life say, "Oh, politics, like I could never, I hate politics." And I think a lot of people hate politics, but for me, the reason I have an interest in it is I also get exhausted by bureaucracy, but I think what I'm really interested in is how politics affects people. And also, I just do have a general kind of nerdy interest in, like, kind of the question you were posing. I generally have a nerdy interest in, like, why people choose who they choose and how campaigns work. So that's kind of why I like covering it. I
Mhm.
would say I think I've always had some interest. Like, I've always, like, when I turned 18, I was so excited to register to vote. So there's like that civic interest. But I think that covering local and state government gave me a stronger interest in politics and how it impacts people and, like, how certain bills get passed or don't pass in the legislature and how, the impact of elections and who has money and who doesn't, things like that. So yes, that would be, I would say I've
Right.
always had some interest, but it's grown stronger as I've continued to do this.
Thank you.
Ginny, going back quickly to the primary race, I always speculated that also Brooks would have strong vote coming out of Baltimore that would give her an edge on Trone. Do you know if there's been anything about that that maybe fed into the race in addition to the dynamic you were describing?
I don't know. I have not, there are numbers that I can also send this. There's like a really good breakdown on the State Board of Elections website that has like each county, each city, that breaks it down really well. I do not, I will say I have not been able to look. I've been so Montgomery County focused and focused on the District 6 race that I have not looked at the Baltimore numbers. I do know she got really good support in Prince George's County, which, even though that could seem obvious because she's the executive there, the county executive there, Trode put out an ad kind of trying to attack her with, I'm sure so many of you saw it, with a lot of her colleagues that he was basically trying to use to discredit her, like saying she was a nightmare to work with, yada, yada, yada. And then other colleagues came out after that and said this isn't true. So I'm not quite sure. I'll be honest, I have not followed as much the Baltimore of it all, I guess you could say. But I will say what I think is interesting is that David Trode lives in Montgomery County, but I don't think Montgomery County necessarily like claims him because he has not been as involved in the local politics, etc. So I think people kind of see David Trode as almost like this outside. He's not this name that they've known forever until he started running.
In the chat, Bill Wydrow asks, "Yeah, I have to say I'm a YIMBY, Ginny, but Bill wants to know about people who are concerned about overdevelopment of housing in Montgomery County."
I am looking at the question. I will say I do tend to hear from more people who want more housing and are concerned about affordable housing. I will say there's a lot of different arguments about how to fix affordable housing. Some people say you build more housing, some people disagree with that. I do think you mentioned traffic. Traffic is something I hear about all the time. People are always emailing me about some road that they're upset about. There's very polarizing views on bike lanes. It's something that I'm very, very cognizant of. Um, some people view them as extremely important and vital to their everyday lives. There's some people who are saying it's clogging up my commute. So kind of to go back to like the controversies of local government and politics, there's some things that seem like really mundane, but I think the roads is a really big thing that people care deeply about, and that I think local government officials are trying to juggle a lot of these, differing interests. People feel very, very strongly. And I will say, I have seen people get almost the ugliest at each other about certain parkways and roads as opposed to things that you might view as more controversial issues. So I do hear a lot about from people about traffic. But the housing, that I would say in the county council, they're very much pushing the we need to build more and different housing. Of course, that's the 11 people who are on the county council right now. So,
But isn't it all build more housing in areas that are already dense? In other words, the more you concentrate housing already in dense areas, that will be more people walking and less driving and all that. Well, that's the argument anyway.
well, there's actually a really interesting piece of legislation that passed that would like a county piece of legislation to clarify that would allow it was going to allow develop like so right now or before this bill passed in the law in the county law, if you built like an apartment complex, you had to have a certain amount of parking for residents. This new legislation would allow developers to build fewer parking spaces. And there's like a whole mathematical formula to figure out how many you would have to build, but within the county code. But you would be able to build fewer if you were located within walking distance of a bus stop or a metro station. And the idea is to incentivize developers to build in those areas. Um, if they're presuming that like I used to live I don't anymore but I used to live in downtown Silver Spring, and I know I personally had a lot of neighbors that did not have a car, and they lived there because they wanted to take the metro, so that could be a good option for some people. Now there might be some people that don't like want that housing because they're like, I want to have my car, but that is one of the ways that I know the county council specifically is trying to address that issue.
Actually, can I go back to one thing you were talking about, Ginny, about bike lanes and the disputes about that? So, one interesting thing of have you done any stories about the old Georgetown Road bike lanes?
Oh yes. Oh yes. It's been a while because we've
Because
been a little understaffed, but there was a time where yes, very much.
because this was hard for drivers in the beginning because they didn't know what to do.
Yes.
But now that the drivers know what to do, the striking thing is how it's cut back the number of people and bikes and crashes dramatically.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely, I think I remember when the study first came out, it was like, and don't directly, I wrote an article about it that I will send you, Jonathan, that you can link. But there was, I think it was like a 30-second to 1 minute extension of the commute time, which a lot of people saw as definitely worth it for safety reasons. There were other people that were like, I don't want any addition to my commute time. So that it's definitely interesting to see how that old Georgetown Road situation has played out.
But I think that my takeaway from that, and I think this is the challenge in local news, um, cover things that work, not only things that don't work.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Uh,
I mean,
let's
yeah, but
let's go to more some of the questions in the chat.
yeah. When questioning a candidate in an interview, is it hard to avoid interjecting your own opinions? It's interesting because I get questions along these lines a lot. I often speak to student groups, and I always get this question from student journalists. Well, there's a couple of things. One, it's really nice when it's an election, like covering the congressional District 6 race. I live in District 8, so I couldn't vote in that race. So that was really nice to feel like I could totally separate myself. But I also think something that I do, particularly when covering elections, is I try to separate, like, when I go into an interview, I try to separate myself from, like, voter Ginny and think about reporter Ginny. And so I will ask questions like, obviously, there's issues that I care about. And I think it's very important to realize that it's impossible to have a journalist that's not going to have some kind of. We all have opinions in life. So it's impossible to ask journalists to not have an opinion back in the back of their head. The problem is when you're showing it in the story. So obviously my life experiences and also my more importantly my experience as a reporter are going to inform some of the questions I ask, but I also try to really include like what I'm hearing from community members and what I'm hearing, like I said, like on the local level. Like I go to so many forums and hearings. So I think it's just like I don't necessarily know how to explain it literally, but I think for me, I am pretty good at separating when I'm doing my job. And I also don't feel like I have had some candidates say some things to me that gave me pause, but I only like push back on it if I think it's something that, like, if it gives me pause because I don't agree with them, I don't say I don't agree with you. But if it's something where, like, it's based on their record or a factual issue or they're criticizing some other official and I need to give the other official a chance to respond, then I'll kind of push back. But I think it's understanding the difference of like when you're doing a job and when you're having an opinion. So like, I had to cover Senate forums. And when I went into those, I didn't think of it as, oh, I'm attending the forum as a voter. I just thought of it as I'm telling people what happened and this is what they literally said. So I think that that's just how I just try to really frame it, as my view is to like kind of just put this information out there and people do with that information what they will. Like for this election I wrote a questionnaire for the congressional candidates and we published in entirety. I mean, we limited them, like you can only have a certain number of words per response because some people would have gone on and on, but we just like I asked a question and we published it in its entirety. And some of those answers, I'll be honest, I would look at, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting thought, but it's not my job to criticize that thought or say that that thought is wrong or that I'm just putting the information out there and the people will see it and they can either agree with that thought or disagree with that thought. So that's kind of how I try to handle that.
And an amazing service that you, as part of this local news, do to do that. Could I just ask you, what tech do you use in the course of your reporting?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm using my personal computer right now, actually, which is a Mac computer, but for work, I do use a Dell laptop. It is not exciting. It is the work provided laptop. But some things that are more what you all might find more interesting is something I use in my like almost every day is this software called Otter. It is artificial intelligence software, which I always feel we always have concerns about artificial intelligence in journalism, but what it does, and I can even show you the app on my phone, you can use it on your phone or on your computer, and essentially you can record an interview and it transcribes it for you. And so that's where the AI comes in because it tries to understand what it's saying. It is not perfect. And like, even like if you follow journalists on Twitter, like I follow all sorts of journalists across the country who will say like they'll share like their funny like otter fails, like funny things that were said that weren't correct, but they're very helpful. Like I'll show um I don't know how well you can see it, but I took a recording of a vote that they were making at the county council on the school's budget. So first of all, it gives you the summary of like, which would be helpful for someone in a meeting that's like, these are the action items. I don't need action items, so I just go to the transcript. But it just shows me what these people said, and you can assign speakers. So that's probably the one thing that makes my life so much easier because instead of having to completely like type out everything that was said, I still have to listen to make sure it was correct and that I don't misquote someone, but I can just kind of copy and paste. And I know that when I've talked to journalists of older generations and they see me whip this out, they're like, oh my God, where was this when I was younger and doing this? So that would probably be like the piece of tech that I find definitely the most helpful in my life. And like I said, I think it was originally made like the way it was originally made for meetings. So it could be great for like if you're going to a meeting and it'll like auto generate what the actions, so and so said somebody needs to send out this email. So yeah, I really like that software very much.
So would you rely on a Otter summary or not so much?
No, because it's really not great for like what I do. Because it'll be like it'll be funny. So it's kind of the funny thing about AI because it like let's say I had a conversation with a county council member about we'll say bike lanes because we're talking about that. The summary will make it sound like we made a decision about something or that we decided that so and so like if the council member said we really need to put more legislation in place, it'll say like the two of us decided to introduce like it'll it's not perfect because I think it's really aimed more so many journalists use it that I don't know why it's like I feel like that's their main target, but I think it originally was created for meetings, so no, I do not rely on those summaries. But for someone who's just like going to a meeting and trying to take notes, I think that would be very helpful.
So on the Otter AI website, it talks about something, a new thing called Meeting Gen AI. Is that?
That's what I was showing you. Yeah, with like it makes you a checklist. It decides what when you're talking about that needs to be a task. So,
Early on, we tried one of the AI summaries as a recap of our meeting, and it changed an answer from one of our more erudite members from no to yes.
oh wow.
So we concluded it wasn't ready for prime time yet. But I think it's improved quite a bit from now, and so now the summaries tend to be pretty useful.
Hmm. Yes. Yes, I definitely have mixed feelings about AI because I think like there's actually someone in the county who created a service that generates like articles based on press releases. So like I'm on all these lists, like the police send out press releases, all this stuff. And I think it can work, but I think the problem is like the errors in it. Like, and I know that that's been a common criticism of like from journalists in AI is like, well, you can you can send AI to record a meeting, but the AI is not going to be able to pick up on the tone of the council member's voice who's clearly like going after the other council, like things like that. So it's one of those things where like I feel like it can definitely be a tool. And like I said, I literally use it every day for these transcripts, but then also like there's parts about it that give me pause. And I think that, humans are always we always need that human edge.
So everybody can think about whether you have any other questions for Ginny, and let me just share a picture. So, Ginny, in appreciation for your appearance today here, we would love to send you a pie mug. And you sent me your address, so afterward we'll be sending that to
Oh,
you.
well, thank you very much.
And oh, so again, to see if anybody else has questions, but so one of the things I wondered about, um, when you're working on local news, do you purposefully keep away from things that are being covered fully and frontally by the larger news organs? Or do you always look at that to see what sort of local angle might be, productive?
I
I'm thinking of the generative AI stuff.
I think that I often look to national news because I would say that there's always a local angle to everything. A lot of the legislation I cover too in Maryland, like can be indicative of larger trends across the country or can buck larger trends. And like an example is Westport just signed into law like last week the Maryland actually this is very interesting with what you all do because it's like kind of an internet thing. The Maryland Kids Code Act, which is like a child internet safety legislation. It'll basically require social media companies to assess risk to children and also like it won't keep because they had to be very careful because of First Amendment stuff and access. It won't keep kids from accessing stuff if they're looking for it, but the idea is they will not be inundated with inappropriate content that they didn't go looking for, and also it'll make it harder for anonymous adults to contact children online. And what's really interesting is we're one of the first states to do this. And also the two legislators who sponsored it are from Jared Solomon and Ben Kramer are from Montgomery County. So that is like that's one of those stories I looked at in the larger context because there was a bill in California that passed and then it got challenged. There was a lawsuit with the big tech companies. And so I here in Maryland, they tried to kind of use that as a lesson of what we can and can't do, what's constitutionally sound. And it did pass, it's been signed into law, and we're one of the first states to have it. I think it's us, California, and then in the United Kingdom, they have really good laws surrounding this, which inspired the California legislation. So like that's something where I look at actually that one was in a global context of what we're doing. So I think you're always like I wouldn't say I actually like I consume a lot of news just as someone who's interested in the news. So I don't necessarily go out and like open the New York Times thinking I'm looking for a story idea in this. But I think because I read so much news, naturally I'm like, this is an issue, this area of the country. I wonder if it's affecting people here, or like I can see parallels between other communities. Obviously, from when I worked in Charlottesville and Montgomery County aren't that far apart, but still, it's always interesting to me when I can see parallels. And I will say, when I first started working here, and you kind of like dive into a new community, you don't know anyone or anything. A lot of what I did was I was like, well, this was an issue in Charlottesville. I bet it's an issue here. I mean, we were talking about housing and affordable housing and how we fix it. And concerns about density and other people being concerned that there's not enough housing. That's everywhere. That was a huge thing I covered in Charlottesville. Like, actually, one of the biggest stories I covered in Charlottesville. Every week there was something with housing because they were approving new zoning maps. And so came here, it's the same problem. Like, yes, geographically it's different. There's differences in the community, but it's still a problem. So I think like it is always interesting to look at things in the national context. Actually, while I'm talking about housing, I did an interesting story about there was county legislation that passed that will allow primarily it's aimed at like houses of worship and churches, but also there's certain nonprofits that are eligible as well. You could now build housing on your property. And this comes from a larger movement of particularly churches that feel that they're having lower attendance, a smaller congregation, and they're like, we have more space than we need and wanting to build affordable housing on their land. This is a national thing. I read an article in Axios about it. In places across the country that do it. They call it Jonathan was saying he's a YIMBY. People call it the Yigby movement. Yes, in God's backyard, which is kind of funny. So like that's a national movement. So when I wrote about that, I wrote about it in the context of like, yes, so Montgomery County approved this, and then like here's the national context of like these are places in the country that also did this. These are places in the country that figured out that this didn't work for them. So I would say yes, I do like to include that context, especially because I think in Montgomery County, our legislators really, some of the county council, I'm thinking of a few that really like to push like, we're the first to do this, and they really want to push these new ideas. And so they're often things that people here haven't heard of and are rightfully like, I don't know how I feel about this. So that's what I often look at, like, well, how did this work in other areas of the country, and did this work for them or not? So yeah, I would say that it's more, like I said, less like me going to the national news and being like, I'm looking for an idea, and more like me trying to think about how we fit in the national context.
And that's adding content that is so helpful. Now, pointing actually to a related topic, earlier in the meeting, we showed the new generative AI with Sal Khan tutoring the AI, tutoring his son in geometry. And Diana, our PI president, was a teacher for many years. That was her career. And one of the things she was wondering is how the heck this sort of smart assistant would be used in the schools. I don't know that that issue has come up in any of the Montgomery County school board races, but maybe it will in the general election.
It has not come up. That would be very interesting. If you want to be the one who shows up to a community forum and asks that question, that would be very entertaining because I feel like this school board race has been I will say we have an excellent education reporter, Elia Griffin. So I do cover education because like I said, I kind of cover everything, but I'm less she is very plugged into that race. But I feel like there's been so much drama with the school system that we've been focusing more on like it's actually gotten very political when it's not supposed to be a political race, and we've been kind of focusing less on like what specifically the kids are, methods of teaching. So that's very interesting. And no, I have not heard it come up. That would be very interesting.
Well, Pi members, have you any other questions for Ginny before we let her go to her so important local news work? Do you want to just show us one of
Brief
your
question.
stories? Oh, did somebody speak up?
Yeah, I think Timothy is talking.
Oh, go ahead, Tim.
I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how we could support local newspapers. I am appalled at the national loss of local newspapers. And with the advent of the internet, it should be even easier for local people to report on local issues. And yet newspapers are folding left and right. So any
Yeah.
thoughts on how to support that? Thank you.
Well, thanks for that question. I'm very passionate about this. I actually left my Charlottesville job in part. That paper still exists, but there were a lot of cuts made. We had had some longtime reporters that left just because they had been there for years and it was time to move on. And then they never replaced those positions. So around the time I left, there were just like two of us, and things were not good. And it was just we were getting all sorts of funding cuts, and it was really stressful. And so even though I loved that community, I like knew it was time to look for something else. And we, where I work at Moco 360, we've struggled too. Our company was sold in January or early February. We found out it was happening in January, but it officially happened in February. And so far, we like the new owners are great, but it just shows that these are, we had some layoffs and it was, upsetting. And so definitely something I care a lot about. And I think like the obvious is to subscribe to your local newspaper. I think that I feel like you probably already are if you're asking this question. Um, for Moco 360, if for people who live in Montgomery County, we don't require a subscription to view our content, but we do have a membership that is really helpful. If you are a member, and you can do any amount, like we have recommended amounts so that you can do like I think the lowest is 10, but you can do lower. Like if you just want to give $1 a month, that's something you could do. So and I can send Jonathan the link on our website, but those donations, like those you can do recurring or one time, they are very helpful to us because it's just difficult. I also think if you own, this is something that was a piece of legislation in Virginia when I was there, and I do not know if it passed, but it's becoming more popular across the country, is some General Assembly members in state houses across the country are trying to create incentives for businesses to advertise in local news, like in local newspapers and things like that. So essentially they would help you fund that. I don't know that I don't think we have that legislation here yet. I think Joe Vogel sponsored it last year, but it didn't go through. But to that point, another school of thought is that like if you are a business owner, especially a small business, putting an ad in the local news. And I understand that a lot of people are like, well, are people reading the newspaper anymore? But also there's websites. So those are also kind of, if you're in a position where you would be taking out an ad for some reason, that's always a way to help. And just, spreading the word about the publication. I think sometimes something that irritates me as a reporter is I see so much about, oh, the media is not covering this. And I'm like, well, someone is somewhere. You might not see it on your TV. So I think it's just making sure people know that this local news is a resource. That's how I would those would be my suggestions. But it's definitely a tough time in local news for sure.
Thanks so much. Bill Wydrow, go ahead.
Yes, I don't remember all of the details, but lately there was an incident of a PE teacher who created a fake audio of his principal, and got the principal into a light, saying that the principal had made some racist comments, which he never did, which leads to the broader question of the advent, now that technology is making it possible, of all kinds of deep fakes coming out, either false conversations or fake videos, particularly in upcoming elections. Have you, as a journalist or journalists in general, found a way or discussed how to publicize when you find a deep fake, or to counter it, or to identify it?
That is a great question. I will say and for those who don't know, that was, I believe, in Baltimore County that a teacher had created AI of a principal saying horrible things, and he of course got fired, and it was all fake. So the Baltimore Banner did some really excellent reporting on that. But it is terrifying for as a journalist. It is very concerning because I think right now we're seeing it more at a national level, like people are making deep fakes of Biden or Trump. And so while it's concerning to me for the state of democracy, I don't cover Biden and Trump in my day-to-day job. But my concern is it's becoming so easy that it could trickle down to the Senate race or congressional race. And I think I don't really know what the answer is to combat it. I will say that I am trying to be even more diligent in when I see something, figuring out if it's real, verifying it. An example that is not a deep fake, it's not that deep of technology, but I think it was kind of a good wake-up call, was I had a local government official contact me off the record and say, and I was out, I was not on work hours, I was like out getting dinner or something. And all right, no, I was actually in a workout class. So I saw when I got out of the workout class that he had texted me and said, I sent you some photos. There was an anti-Semitic protest at XY. I can't even remember. He said some high school in the county. I didn't have a chance to look at it. I drove home, and then as soon as I got home, when I was going to go look at those photos, that same official texted me and said, disregard that. Those aren't real. Then I had to look at the photos because I was like, well, what were these? And this was kind of after October 7th when everything was kind of getting riled up, and there was a protest at a school. I believe it was George Mason University, and I only say that because I could see like flags in the background. So it was obviously not a Montgomery County school. And then there were things on signs that I believe even then had been superimposed digitally because they looked kind of off. Like, so there were some really offensive things posted on signs, and I don't know what they had on signs before that. They could have also been offensive things, but something had been superimposed. And it just really struck me that this person who knows what he's doing is a government official, he fell for it at first. And so I have to be careful too when anybody sends. I think that that's, for me, like I said, for the bigger deep fake question, it's such a good question, and I don't know, it really stresses me out to be honest. But I think for me, what I've been doing is just like, it's one of those things that it's a really good reminder, like, you can't trust something just because someone sent it to you. And even if that person is well-intentioned, like this government official, he truly believed this was real. You've just got to check everything. But yes, that's kind of going back to what I said about AI being a tool, but also scaring me, is I'm terrified about the deep fakes. There was, kind of as a side note, this doesn't really go into the election and the politics part, but there was some legislation that passed the General Assembly this year that would create stronger penalties for deep fakes related to like revenge porn. But that works kind of more on like a personal level as opposed to like politicians stating falsehoods in these things. So I think my hope is we'll see some legislation on this, but I don't know, it's so complicated. And then with the internet, it's like, how do you catch these people? So it's a very good question. And like I said, I don't know if I really answered it, but like I said, I'm very concerned about it.
All righty then. Any other questions or thoughts by members?
I'd just like to thank Ginny for the work that she does and say, keep it up. It's
Thank
really
you.
important. Really, really important.
So Ginny, expect to receive your pie mug some days after the meeting.
Yeah, very nice of you.
And what I'll do is just episodically, I'll include in the recap some links to some of your election coverage.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And thanks so much for coming to our meeting today. And you know what I told people that, we usually have a fourth Saturday meeting that we always move forward a week in May to avoid the Memorial Day
Yeah.
weekend. But I'd never planned on that being the week of the biggest contested primary we've had in Maryland for a long time. So it was, it was our little perfect storm of the very time we were having someone in local news who was full covering that. So thank you for making time for us
Yeah,
today.
of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm sorry that it was such a scheduling back and forth, but I appreciate you having me, and it was great to talk to you all. And definitely, I hope if you live in Montgomery County that you will check us out. And if you don't, check out your own local news for sure. We could use the love. So, and also we're working to keep you informed. So,
Okay, thanks so much.
all right, bye.